journey the human family has been on. You know, Chris Christopherson wrote those words. Janis Joplin made famous. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Freedom. You know, if you look it up, it talks about the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. It's the absence of subjugation. We're talking liberty here. Freedom. Freedom. We all have our own sense of what this means. Some of us don't think we're free and we never have been. Some of us think it's been, like me, think it's a journey. And we're still even discovering what it means. And we're each taking our definition and weaving it into our own personal narrative. But given all that, all the subjective stuff, I want to make some connections. The first connection is to one of the best ideas the human race has ever had, right up there with the wheel, and that's self-rule. Because, you see, I don't think there can be freedom without self-rule. As a matter of fact, freedom is inextricably connected to self-rule. And the idea of self-rule is inextricably connected to the idea of virtue or morality. As one founder said, virtue cannot exist without the freedom to make moral choices. Freedom. Freedom. It's connected to virtue and morality. In short, freedom is connected to goodness. Now, in our founders, many of the heated debates were about virtue and morality, about human beings. How much freedom does freedom mean when we have it? What are the limits to it? And even our documents were not just about assuring certain rights, but also trying to cut off at the pass the less virtuous, so that there were some built-in pieces. Now, in the end, our founders were clear. Only a virtuous people is capable of freedom. Now, it was universally acknowledged that a corrupt and selfish people could never make or sustain self-rule successfully. Franklin himself said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. It's important to realize that freedom is a heavy burden. Tocqueville said, when America became America, the United States, he said, you're the first people to be born into a world where you do not know where you belong, where you do not know where your station is, where you fit. This whole concept of freedom is a weight to carry. It calls for a lot of responsibility to paying attention, getting educated. And I don't mean at a college or going on. I mean staying tuned to what's happening and what is true and real. And most of all, we have to carry this moral clarity. Moral clarity in itself is a confounding conundrum. What is that? And how do we sort it out today? When I was growing up, you knew who the good guys and white guys were in the store. I mean, the good guys and the bad guys were just by the color of their hats. And now if you watch a Law and Order or an NCIS, boy, oh boy, it's all gray area, it seems. And we know that virtue cannot be legislated. It must be bred. It must be grown from a healthy soil full of curiosity, a sense of fairness, an engaged critical ability to discern what is good and what is bad. In the early debates, Madison said, "There is no virtue. Is there no virtue among us? If there not be, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, balance, or form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. If there were sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of these men so that we do not depend upon their virtue, or put confidence in our rulers, but in the people who are to choose them. Thomas Jefferson counseled, virtue is not hereditary. And as one historian wrote, virtue has to be earned and it has to be learned. Neither is virtue a permanent quality in human nature. It has to be cultivated continually and exercised from hour to hour and from day to day. The founders looked to the home, the school, and the churches to fuel the fires of virtue from generation to generation. After serving 8 years as our first president, George Washington, he sensed the tendency of the people in a free republic to begin to forget the bedrock of virtue and morality, so necessary to the preservation of the republic that the founders gave us. Thus, in his farewell address, he declared this: of all the dispositions and habits which led to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Washington, all of these, they were saying what we need to pay attention to. Today we're at a crossroads in my mind, telling us whether we are capable of freedom, because that's the question I've asked. Is the human being capable of freedom? Is freedom just too big a burden and self-rule a pipe dream, calling us to be too responsible in too many different directions, having to pay attention, not just of dealing with everyday stuff, but my God, we have to pay attention to what's going around us? Can't someone just take care of us? You know, after the final vote was taken in Philadelphia, Franklin came out and it said that a woman came up to him and said, "What kind of government do we have? What kind of government?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if we can keep it." In my life and in the last few decades, self-rule seems to be devolving into oligarchy, autocracy, authoritarianism, this nationalism that disguises itself as patriotism. And so I have to ask, can we keep it? And how? And that's my question today. And I'll be honest to our listeners. We have listeners all over the world. We have listeners in most of the United States. We would love to hear from you regarding this podcast. Basically, for the sake of our country and becoming more informed, Redhawkthedeepend at gmail.com. Redhawkthedeepend at gmail.com. That's all one word. And on that note, I'm going to throw this whole thing at my cohorts here. The fact is, we've talked about this offline quite a bit. You know, we're concerned and have genuine fears for our country and the republic itself. And how do we move forward, much less just keeping the tide of the past from overwhelming us. So Bob, we'll start with you. Bob Hayes is coming to us from Florida. Mary Ann Rudis from Spokane Valley, and my name is Red Hawk, and I'm coming to you from Spokane, Washington, the best breathing air the country has to offer. My friends, here's Bob with his response. What say you, Bob?
Well, I think that you've alluded to this already, but the idea of freedom has to go hand in hand with the idea of responsibility, because we've discussed many times, no one is isolated in this world. We're always connected to other people, some of whom we've never met, but we're connected to them. And if one's freedom does not also include one's responsibility for others' freedom, then eventually we're going to lose the freedom that we think we have. And I think that this is becoming more and more apparent in our politics today, and just in the way society is moving. We seem to be willing to accept a small little chunk of freedom. I'm going to be happy in my own little world with my own little set of small goals and small rewards, and I don't really care what other people are doing as long as they leave me alone. Well, that doesn't really work. And the big question is, can we have individual freedom for everyone? And if that means that each individual has to give up a little bit of their own freedom so that other people have more freedom, then that's a choice we have to make. And that gets back to, you just talk about virtue. Where do we learn these things today? Maybe in the time of our founding fathers, we learned it from the church, but we certainly don't learn it from the church today. I mean, I can see few institutions that are more immoral than the church. You look at the history of it. You look at the way that it has really treated people badly. And I don't know whether or not freedom is a viable concept today, because we haven't learned what it means. We don't take civics classes anymore in school. We need to learn that balance between freedom and responsibility.
Amen. Mary Ann?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think responsibility is very important, and I kind of see things right now as these separations that we're experiencing. There's this me and mine mindset, and then there's an us and ours mindset. And so where is the line where our freedom impedes others' freedom? And so I think that's where responsibility, that's where morals and virtue and our ethics come into play, because without those, with or without religion, I don't know that religion is a necessary factor, but I think there are people that are within religious traditions that uphold virtues and moral and ethics, and there are people within those traditions that don't. But I also think that there are people outside of those traditions that can have virtue, that have morals, that have ethics that guide their lives. And so I think it really does come down to our personal responsibilities. And again, and I know I say this a lot, we have to work on ourselves. And as we work on ourselves and we get in touch with virtues, with morals, and decide where is our line in the sand, and where is that line where our necessity to be free actually encourages others to be free as well. Because if one of us isn't free, none of us are free. And that's a huge, huge concept. But I think that where we're at now, it's a fine, I mean, it's worth discussing, let's put it that way. So.
Well, it's something you both touched on that the founders also made a big deal of, and that's the word responsibility. And if you look at their understanding of the word virtue, it meant that you were able to see beyond your own personal interests, and you had the freedom to limit that, okay, for the sake of the community. And that good, virtuous people would do that. They would have the ability to see beyond themselves and be able to do not what's just good for themselves, but what's good for the community. Now, of course, what corruption means is that you no longer do that. As Franklin said, selfish people cannot rule. They can't self-rule, they will need masters. And
Right.
that's kind of where we are now. So it's almost like, I have to say, for me, the church was pretty amazing. And that's not that I got a whole lot, from going every week, but there were a couple things that touched me. And I shared this before. The day our pastor, and we had a packed church, it was full of generals and State Department people and, big wigs. It was Westminster Presbyterian in Alexandria, Virginia. And the minister said, if anybody would have a problem with a Negro coming into this church and sitting next to them in the pew to worship God, then I'll give you a minute to leave. That's as quiet I've ever heard the church. I wonder how much that impacted me that I became a minister. Of course, that was rare in my ministry to see that stuff. The whole concept of how we create virtue and what constitutes virtue and what makes a virtuous human being. I think that those were huge questions of our founders. And I say founders because, half these people's ideas, Dolly Madison was one savvy human being, and I know he learned more from his discussions with her. I think of John Adams and Abigail Adams. My gosh, these were the founders. The men get the press. But, it started with white landowners becoming free from a despot, a monarchy. And that freedom they understood their understanding itself, and that they were fallible, and they left things wide open. That's one of the coolest things about our constitutional system. It's not done. It's still being created. We not just the black folks weren't just enslaved, but they were also freed. And once they were freed, they were eventually the rights were taken away, and then they had to be given back again. It's the story of freedom is one that is enduring, and it's not done. And both of you, I think, have not just insinuated, but suggested that in spades, that we almost need to find a new axis mundi around some ideas or something, and immortalize them in such a way that people can gather around them and become virtuous. Because I think you both said it, the church has very limited effect today on all of that in a positive way. I think
in some circles, I think the church is still wielding a lot of influence, but sometimes it's being wielded in not such a great way. But I think there are churches out there that are wielding some great influences. But I think something that's really important is education. And you talk about the founding fathers, they were educated, and they knew how to think critically. They knew how to think for themselves. And I think that's something that, as we are seeing signs of slipping into authoritarianism, it's part of that is because people we haven't educated I think there's a whole generation that hasn't learned how to think critically. We've taken some of that away in the schools, and a lot of it becomes rote and follow the rules and do this and do that, and you'll have a good life. And not questioning, not being able to discern, I think that is a big impediment to being able to self-rule. We have to be able to know how to think.
Amen.
Yeah, and I think people today, because of what, Marianne, you're just saying, they don't understand. Most people don't even know what it means to talk about the Founding Fathers. People don't realize that, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance didn't occur until the 1950s. The Star Spangled Banner didn't become our national anthem until the 1930s. Our founding fathers didn't have anything to do with that stuff. Much like the church has been perverted by people who have moved away from the kind of teachings of the founders of the church, we've moved away from the real essence of what our founding fathers were trying to get at in terms of freedom and responsibility. And again, we got to get back to that through education, but we don't seem to have the will to provide good education in this country. This is a question that has been going around ever since I've been alive. We've got to fix education. We got to fix the education system. We got to fix the public schools, or do we need private schools, or how do they work together? Or, we need to come to some kind of an understanding of what the basics are in terms of civics, in terms of teaching critical thinking, in terms of teaching the real history of our country.
Yeah.
And
well, who gets
to have the will to do that?
Who gets to decide what is real on that? And that's going to be a podcast that we're going to deal with soon, called "What Is Reality." Because like we said in our last podcast, we're all projecting, right? So it gets lost in that, and that's why I kind of opened with we're all making something of our own understanding of freedom, and then weaving it into our own narratives. The places where we're free, the places where we don't feel free, so we gotta fight it or do work, or Joseph Campbell talked about our dragons are really, you want to write that book, but you don't. Well, why don't you? Whatever's standing between you and that book is your dragons. How do you become free? That understanding has helped me in my retirement really a lot, because there's a lot of good TV. You just can't keep up with it all. There's a lot of good books. You can't keep up. And so, how do you keep that other piece alive? And that is the part that's liberating to me. And I think I shared with you before the podcast, I picked up my electric guitar again and putting together a band. My wife and my son are in the band. My son's playing drums. A good friend of his is playing lead guitar. And I have not felt that young after a rehearsal in decades. It's amazing what frees you, what liberates you from the stuff that binds you, and how that works. And I think Marianne, you opened that we got to do our inner work, because that's, I always said that it looked to me, and I think Watts, I get this from Alan Watts, the West has been working on freedom without, and the East has been working on freedom within, and it's been a two-pronged journey for the planet, and those two parts are getting together. But I want to touch on something. I think what you all talked about, critical thinking, is huge. But sometimes I think, even today, it's too much. You know what I mean? It's like, Jesus Christ. If you keep up, every day is an existential affair. And the fact is, yes, it is. And it takes a lot of attention. We get back to our responsibility, our ability to respond. And I'm not sure sometimes that, when we talked about stages of faith or stages of spiritual development, those who need a structure outside of them to tell them what's right and wrong, versus those who have internalized those measures, if you will. So I think... Go ahead, Marianne.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we're at a crossroads, and it's a conundrum of confounding proportions, biblical proportions. Go ahead, Marianne.
Well, something that you just said made me think about finding out what is true. We're living in a time where it's really hard to distinguish what is actually true, and without a consensus on the truth, we're in a really precarious time. And are we ever really free? You talk about free from public opinion, free to express ourselves, free to do what we want to do in our own lives. And many of us put those external restrictions on ourselves. And I think part of this comes with age. I think as we get older, we can become more and more free because we're not in a place where we're trying to get something back from the world. I think there's a shift that occurs, and that's why I think elders are respected, because as you get older, it's what can I give to the world, versus when we're younger, it's what can the world give me. And I don't know how I got on this tangent, but yeah, but I think that's real freedom.
Yeah, and we're getting to the edge of our thing. So, Marianne, save your last thought. Bob, your last thoughts on this?
Well, I just want to emphasize something that you kind of touched on, but I think it deserves a little bit more emphasis, and that is the difference between external freedom and internal freedom. If you look at some of the writings of Nelson Mandela, when he talks about his time in prison, and he talks about how he was free in prison. It didn't matter what the guards had to say. It didn't matter that he couldn't leave his cell. He was free, and there was nothing that the external world could do to take that freedom away from him. Now, that then in turn leads to a whole raft of ways of thinking about the world. And once he got out of prison, he was not interested in revenge. He was not interested in taking freedom away from other people. He had learned that the freedom existed within himself, and he was striving to help others find that kind of freedom. That's why they had these hearings and committees and so forth that were, again, not looking to punish anyone, but to get the truth out and figuring out how to move forward. So I think that, again, it gets back to what we've been saying in a number of different ways: education, learning what it truly means to take responsibility, and how that responsibility needs to be spread around your community and your nation.
Amen. Marianne, final comments?
Yeah, I think freedom is a dynamic movement, and that it's always, you don't attain freedom and then have it forever. You have to cultivate it and keep it and work on it. And I think every generation has its own challenges that they have to face with these questions. And I think that the more that we can acknowledge that we are all in this together, the closer we can get to being free for all of us.
Amen. And I think you put your finger on our founders' understanding of virtue, which is it's an everyday, sometimes hour to hour thing that we need to keep in mind. And I want us to get that what really we're going on here is freedom and virtue are in hand. It's about the greater good. And how do we get to the greater good? Well, it's by growing goodness, and that's what we've been talking about here. Freedom and goodness have to go hand in hand. And if there's not an attempt of goodness, and think about what that meant for the founders. That meant that one's personal interests are self-limited by a genuine concern for the community. For the community. And I think that understanding of community is a lot of what we've been talking about. But we're also talked about, we're kind of in a bit of a pickle today. I called it a crossroads, and it's a big crossroads. In a song I wrote called Patriot Song, it's like every generation has its own iteration where the dark comes in to play with the light. Wow, we got a hell of an iteration going on, right? So what has to happen? It's like we have to turn something that's dross and turn it into gold. How do we turn this puppy around? What's the equation? Is there an equation for it? How do we do that? Well, next podcast, we're going to go there. It's called Transformation. In alchemy, they were trying to turn, lead into gold. How do we transform these? We have to put it in a crucible and make it really hot and burn it up. Sometimes I feel like right now, the transformation that we're getting ready to go into, we're just getting thrown into the crucible. I know in my own personal journey, I've always had to go into the crucible before I changed. Oh, I did not like it, but the transformation, maybe a chrysalis is a better word as the butterfly arises. We'll see. Until then, blessings, my friend. Blessings.